My name is Ben Hillman. For those of you who are visiting for the first time, I'm the director of the Australian Centre on China and the World. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional country of the Ngunnawal peoples, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. We respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land. I also extend respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. It's a great pleasure tonight to introduce a speaker who has flown all the way from DC and only managed to arrive today after flight disruptions across the United States. Jude Blanchette he holds the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, he was Engagement Director at the Conference Board's China Centre for Economics and Business in Beijing, where he researched China's political environment with a particular focus on the workings of the Communist Party of China and its impact on foreign companies and investors. Prior to working at the Conference Board, Jude was the Assistant Director of the 21st Century China Centre at the University of California, San Diego. So it's a fantastic opportunity for us to host Jude here tonight, and we'd also like to thank our colleagues at DFAT because the visit is sponsored by DFAT's China Experts Program. So this is the first of many talks and engagements that Jude will be involved with, sponsored by DFAT this week. So without further ado, Jude, welcome. We look forward to hearing your thoughts, and we have an hour together, so which will roughly be divided into some half an hour talk, followed by 20-30 minutes of questions. Big welcome to Jude Blanchette from CSIS.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to stand at an awkward angle to you to make everyone's neck strain over the next 30 minutes. And likewise, I'd like to thank Ben for the gracious hosting, and to DFAT. My only quibble being the word experts, because I don't know about any of you, but I find the entire concept of a China expert makes about as much sense to me as someone saying they're an America expert or a France expert. But nonetheless, it is the burden we all bear for those of us who work on China. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, but I'd really like to spend most of the time in conversation with all of you. Happy to answer questions unrelated to what I'm going to talk about tonight. We have a momentous election coming up in the United States that I'm sure folks are curious about, especially as it regards our, America's China policy. But really happy to answer anything that may be on your mind. The topic tonight that I want to talk about is something that we're actually exploring in my work at CSIS. So these are tentative remarks based on some early phase research, but nonetheless, I think a topic that's important because there is a fairly significant paradigm shift happening in China right now. And I should say, actually, I think there's a paradigm shift happening in lots of places right now, of which the United States, the West more broadly, China, everyone in their own way is moving in a liminal phase from a set of understandings we had about the nature of globalization, engagement, where we thought political trajectories in geopolitics were going, and now we're in this phase where, again, going back to the word expert, I don't really know what's happening right now, but it's clear that words like left and right in the United States don't mean much anymore, or the understandings we had about what it meant to be on the left and what it meant to be on the right is undergoing a profound shift. A question of just what is the purpose of America's China policy, I don't think anyone really knows right now, whereas 10 years ago, there was a model built around engagement that had a mechanism for understanding, well, we're going to engage with China because we expect this is where it's going to take us. I think that's all out the door right now, and we're really in a phase of discovery. And then I think things where 10 years ago we criticized China for elements of their political economy, like the focus on economic security, industrial policy, all those things we said were bad about the Chinese economic structure Now these are part and parcel of the US discussion about how we want to structure our own economy. Words like de-risking, decoupling, which in some ways lack real concrete definition, in other ways indicate the direction of travel as economies in the West, in China and elsewhere, try to forge a new path ahead in light of shocks like COVID, shocks like Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think all of this is happening right now, and it makes, at least to me, clarity somewhat difficult. Nonetheless, I think it's important that even at these tentative early stages, we try to find ways to grope through and at least try to articulate what we think some of the early understandings of this new paradigm are. And one of them for me is watching big changes in China's political economy that have been occurring over the last decade, and I think accelerating over the last few years. And one of those changes is what I call Xi Jinping's counter-containment strategy. What do I mean by that? In March of last year, Xi Jinping said on the margins of the National People's Congress meeting, quote, the external environment for China's development has changed drastically, with uncertainties and unexpected factors increasing remarkably. In particular, Western countries, headed by the United States, have contained, encircled, and suppressed China in an all-around way, bringing unprecedentedly severe challenges to China's development. Now, when Xi Jinping made that comment, it was notable for him calling out the United States directly. Those of you who read Xi Jinping's speeches, follow his comments, know a little bit like Voldemort in Harry Potter, Xi Jinping often didn't mention the United States by name. He would mention some countries, certain powers, certain hegemonic powers, hostile foreign forces, but would not often call the United States out by name. But this was a very, very pointed remark. I think it's also notable that Xi Jinping made this remark not in 2018 at the depths of the trade war with the United States, but in the spring of 2023 under a US Democratic administration, one that certainly in comparison to the Trump administration was far more careful and balanced in its China policy, but nonetheless was pushing forward a series of policies which Xi Jinping said were so threatening to China's economic development model that they were, again to quote, that they were bringing unprecedentedly severe challenges to China's development. So I want to talk a bit about this counter-containment strategy and put it into context. And before I do that, though, I want to put it in a little bit of historical context, because this didn't come out of nowhere. And in fact, some of what Xi Jinping was articulating about the idea of China's economy being vulnerable to external pressure is as old as the PRC itself. This really dates back to even before 1949 in the caves of Yan'an, and as the Communist Party under Mao was fighting the Japanese, a policy of self-reliance, 自力更生, began to develop as the Communist Party had to fight an asymmetric war with the Japanese and with the nationalists, and so began to develop a series of policy measures and political culture around the fact that we're going to have to do this ourselves. We're going to have to build economic models that prioritize local action, self-sufficiency. Mao expanded this even beyond the war with Japan, and in 1945, in a speech in Yan'an, said, quote, relying on the forces we ourselves organize, we can defeat all Chinese and foreign reactionaries. Now, in the 1950s, this idea of self-reliance went on the back burner as a very unself-reliant Communist Party welcomed in Soviet advisors and monies and technical assistance. But then came to the fore again during the Cultural Revolution. And really, actually even just before the Cultural Revolution, probably reached its apex with the so-called Third Front, where Mao, out of a concern of either a US attack or a Soviet attack on China, forcibly and physically moved most of China's defense industrial base and industrial capacity into the hinterland of China as a way to protect it from foreign attack and invasion. And then in the Cultural Revolution, this spirit of self-sufficiency permeated Chinese political culture. You remember the campaign to learn from Dajai, this model commune, which had figured out a way to be self-sufficient and self-reliant, and nonetheless reach levels of unprecedented economic prosperity in an environment of definitely uncertain economic statistic veracity, but nonetheless continued to permeate this idea of self-sufficiency. So it has been long a part of Chinese political culture, certainly in the post-49 period, to think about China's economy as being vulnerable to external pressure, whether that's Soviet pressure, US pressure, and to prioritize this culture and this spirit of self-sufficiency. Xi Jinping is not Mao Zedong, but I think this is important as historical context because as we saw through the first 5-10 years of Xi Jinping's tenure, a return of this idea of self-reliance, it did not come from nowhere. The second point as context is throughout the Xi Jinping period starting in late 2012, Xi Jinping's view of markets began to dim. Even before the trade war, even before US technology controls, you could see Xi Jinping renegotiating his view of the value of markets. 2013, so just a year after Xi Jinping takes power as General Secretary of the Communist Party, the third plenum of the 18th Central Committee comes out. This is a document that excited many in the private sector, many foreign investors. This is where you saw China talk about the market playing a decisive role in allocating resources. That was probably the high mark of Xi Jinping's benign view of markets. And a series of events subsequent to that, you began to see Chinese policy and Xi Jinping's own statements reflect more uncertainty and questioning about the role of markets. In 2015, you'll remember there was a massive equity market downturn that required the Chinese national team of sovereign wealth funds and state investors to step in and prop up the market. And coming out of that moment, Xi Jinping now had a much more dim view of markets, not only that they were bad allocators of resources, but more importantly, that relatively unfettered market activity was a political risk to the Communist Party. And I think that 2015-2016 period was really a profound hinge moment for how the leadership thought about markets. The party had always thought about markets less in a normative way, like we do in the United States or in Australia, where we wrap markets around sort of ethical norms and ideas of individualism. The party had always seen markets as mechanisms, as tools. But I think here under Xi Jinping after 2015, 2016, it was, we're going to have to really constrain market forces, and actually left on their own, they will lead to political risks. 2015 is also the year we saw the announcement of the Made in China 2025 industrial policy plan, reflecting another element of Xi Jinping's thinking, which is markets are fine, sure, but we're going to, in the words of Barry Naughton, have to steer markets and steer capital. That's a halfway point, I think, between sort of pure neoliberalism and pure state planning. So markets are going to have a role, but within a relatively constrained environment. And it reminds me of the old conservative reformist Chen Yun, a peer of Deng Xiaoping, who in the early 1980s articulated the idea of the birdcage economy, where Chen said, the market economy is a bird. You hold it too tightly and you kill it. But you let it go and it flies away. So you need to take that market economy and you need to put it in a cage. And the party will be there to adjust the size of the cage. Sometimes the cage can be wider and the bird can have more autonomy to fly around. Sometimes we're going to have to pull the bars in tighter. But there always has to be bars. I think many of us in the West forgot about Chen Yun, but Chen Yun's spirit lives large. And Xi Jinping in many ways is the inheritor of the sort of Chen Yun view of skeptical conservative view of markets. So that's all backdrop. That's all happening even before geopolitical competition with the United States really heats up, starting with the election of Donald Trump in 2016. But again, we're already seeing more industrial policy. We're already seeing more market skepticism. We're seeing Xi Jinping tie markets to political risk. April 2015, 2016, at a Politburo meeting, Xi Jinping says that economic security is national security. So you're starting to see a layering of concerns coming from Xi Jinping. But I think the real sort of break point was when rivalry between the US and China reached a more open, direct level of intensification starting after the election of Donald Trump. And I don't want to relive the Trump administration, partly because it's painful and it may be coming back. So I want to just yada, yada, yada right over this, but simply to say, for the Chinese, that was a pretty important moment in terms of their thinking about external markets and their relationship to the G7. You saw a range of actions starting with the Trump administration, not just on the tariff front, but going after Huawei and trying to stop countries like Australia and others from utilizing Huawei and their 5G networks. You saw actions against ZTE and other Chinese firms. You saw a real pronounced rise in the number of sanctions on Chinese companies. When Biden was elected in November of 2020, there was a brief pause where I think the Chinese stopped and watched to assess what this new Biden administration would do. And pretty quickly it became clear that the Biden administration was going to carry on many of the measures that the Trump administration did. But more worryingly for Beijing, do so in a far more systematic, legally regulatory sound way. And more importantly, probably start to go after key technologies. Whereas Trump administration was about trade, the Biden administration has focused very much on these key and emerging technologies like semiconductors and using regulatory tools to stop China from getting access to some technologies which they think are going to and find their way into a PLA technology ecosystem. Other shocks that I think affected Xi Jinping was the war in Ukraine, or what Xi Jinping would probably still call a special military operation. But nonetheless, the invasion by the Russians of Ukraine, but more importantly, the sanctions by the United States and its allies, which came after that, I think really shook the Chinese because they began to see this as a potential playbook that the United States and its allies might potentially use against China if there was a conflict between the two countries. So from this general geopolitical context, what Xi Jinping would call profound changes unseen in a century of the geopolitical environment going under a profound shock, the relationship with the United States seeing a really significant deterioration, but layered on top of pre-existing trends of Xi Jinping becoming more skeptical about market mechanisms, seeing political risks from markets themselves, you now begin to see the more clear articulation of a counter-containment set of policies. And what is this? It's utilizing industrial policy as a means to achieve outcomes that you don't think the market economy on its own will achieve. So through not only steering capital into industrial policy mechanisms, things like government guidance funds that are then channeling capital into robotics, AI, quantum, but also using punitive regulatory measures to send a signal to the market of where you don't want capital to go. See the regulatory crackdown on the technology sector from a few years ago, which was a high-level political action for Xi Jinping to say, we have scarce technology, talent, and capital, and I don't want it going into some app company that's going to let you get your delivery, your food delivery 6 minutes quicker. That's not a good use of scarce capital. We want this to be going into technologies which are going to build hard power for this country and are also going to build sectors and industries of the future like green tech. So it's that combination of both formal tools like government guidance funds and steerage of capital through state investors, but also political signals and regulatory measures designed to say, this is a no-go zone. We want capital to be going over here. I think a second key thread of this was fortification. Ensuring that the Chinese economy was going to be able to withstand geopolitical pressures and shocks. So building a financial system that is going to be able to, if there is a playbook similar to what the United States enacted on Russia, if that's enacted on China, that China's going to be able to survive in that. And that's where Chinese analysts have been watching the Russian experience very, very closely. And if you track Chinese discourse on the war in Ukraine, March, April 2022 is spent marveling in shock at the severity of sanctions, discourse today is marveling at the Russian economy's ability to withstand them. How did the Russians find ways to rebuild FX pipelines with China so that way they don't need US dollar access, right? So right now, bilateral trade between China and Russia is 95% settled in rubles and renminbi, and the vast majority of that is the renminbi. How has Russia been able to rebuild its industrial base by building bilateral relations so it can still get access to the commodities and inputs it needs to run its economy? China was already thinking about a lot of this. It had built its own alternative to SWIFT called CSIS. It was already working on building renminbi piping to key bilateral countries, especially in commodities, energy. So if it ever did come under US sanctions pressure, it was already sort of working to hedge against that, but those efforts have intensified significantly. So now no one's worried about the renminbi dethroning the US dollar as a global reserve currency. That's not where to look. Where you should be looking is at how China's been able to use the renminbi more and more to transact cross-border trade with specific countries that it sees as strategically important. So right now, of all China's external trade, about 30%, if you X out Hong Kong, about 30% of that is being done with the renminbi. So global reserve currency, no, but as building out sufficient bilateral relations to where it feels like it will be able to mitigate some of the US sanctions pressure, China has made great strides on this. There are other areas that China is playing around that I think hasn't found much effect yet, like building its own digital currency that is still in sort of trial period. But you can see China watching the war in Ukraine, watching the evolving US sanctions playbook, and trying to figure out what is the array of tools that it is going to be able to use to be able to fortify itself and really, if it does come into conflict, be able to withstand through that. I think one point to mention here is in the US, a lot of the narrative is around Xi Jinping building a fortress economy. There's a lot of focus on the frequency with which Xi Jinping uses the word self-reliance, self-sufficiency. And I think that can give the impression that Xi Jinping wants to wall off the Chinese economy. And I think that's the wrong way to look at it. A counter-containment strategy in many ways is going to see the Chinese push out into the global economy in new and interesting ways. And this is where I think obviously building out relations with the global south is a key part of this. This is where China trying to expand its trade relations and try to get those transactions cleared in the renminbi is part of a new going out strategy, but going out strategy built around geopolitics. And if I can quote Xi Jinping's previous close economic advisor, Liu He, who is now an informal advisor for Xi, he said in 2022, we must continue to open wider to the flows of goods and factors of production, attract high quality factors and products such as capital, technology, and talent from around the world, and break the external containment and suppression of China. So this is not a sort of an inward look, crouching position where China is just building up a wall around itself. This in many ways is going to be an increasingly active China on the global market, just in different ways than we've seen before. And if you look at some of the macro political blueprints like dual circulation, right, the new development pattern that they talk about, these are still about building interlinkages with the world, but just on China's terms. One of the reasons there is this conversation about overcapacity in Brussels and in Washington, D.C., is because China is trying to build industries, green tech industries, which will be dominant in global markets, produced and manufactured in China and sold to the world. So this is not a sort of walling off of China. Now, I think the big question is this going to work? And to what effect? It's remarkable if I think when I was living in China in 2012 until I left in 2018, how much of a shift you could feel happening in the discourse on the nature of China's economy and how China wanted to be integrated in the world. The conversation now is deeply securitized. Even if you understand Xi Jinping's views, this has taken on a life of its own and is not just happening in response to US pressure. There is a perpetual motion machine of concern about national security internal to China that is rewiring the entire system. So you had Xi Jinping in 2013 announce the holistic national security concept, or the overall national security concept, which has been a full-scale, top-to-bottom build-out of an administrative state designed around dealing with national security concerns. And those national security concerns are as wide and as high as this room. These are not narrow concerns. These run the range from, concerns about culture and history, in addition to traditional national security concerns. That's then merging with concerns around economic security, which is merging around concerns of technological security. So all of this is being consumed. I'm going to mix all my metaphors here, but this is now sort of becoming a black hole where everything is being sucked into this national security outlook. And you increasingly see Xi Jinping distracted from what could be a fundamental, true rejuvenation strategy, which is what he says he wants to do. A true rejuvenation strategy would see Xi Jinping addressing the many obvious and profound development challenges that China is facing, right? If, given how powerful he is, I would be impressed if I saw Xi Jinping spending his time thinking about revamping China's medieval tax system, which needs desperately, desperately to be overhauled, right? About 7% of the population pays into an income tax. It's still heavily reliant on VAT. Many, many ways for companies to get around paying their taxes. Not enough people working in the tax bureaucracy. Issues like a property tax, which they occasionally get close to the fire and they pull their fingers away immediately, is a baffling misuse of the sheer amount of political capital that Xi Jinping has accumulated. It's not that he can't challenge vested interests. We've seen him revamp the People's Liberation Army. That's no easy matter. But it is baffling that he is spending his time focused on great power competition much more than he is thinking about hukou reform or dealing with demographic challenges, which are going to have a real functional bite on China's productivity. So I think there is a worrying cycle that Xi Jinping has gotten himself into, whereas there's obvious and clear challenges China's facing in the external environment. One doesn't have to agree with Xi Jinping or his outlook or the Communist Party to see that from their own position, they feel like they're in a very, very contested geopolitical environment. But the way to deal with that would be a true rejuvenation strategy about dealing with the many complex, deep challenges that China's economy faces. And Xi Jinping won't address any of those if he continues on a path of essentially fortification of China's economy. He may build a fortress economy, but at the expense of truly rejuvenating China. The second dynamic is the United States and China are just feeding off of each other in a downward loop right now, where each country takes an action which is perceived by the other to be hostile. The other responds with its own self-protection mechanism, which is then interpreted by the other as a move to prepare for more conflict, and on we go. And that I just find is so worrying, and it is affecting how the rationality of both countries. I think the United States still has enough elements of civil society which are there to question and challenge the agenda, and I don't see those operating as effectively in China. So whereas there's an open conversation right now in China, and you will see some criticize some of the more security-minded measures the Biden administration takes as, well, we shouldn't out China by being China. That's a very robust part of the debate. I don't hear as much of that on the Chinese side, which is worrying. This is the challenge of having a one-man autocratic system is course corrections are difficult. This is why leadership changes used to happen every 10 years in China, but that is no longer the case. So I'm uncertain when you're going to see a fundamental trajectory shift. So I'll end on a very pessimistic note, which is I think the worse the geopolitical environment comes for China, the more it affirms for Xi Jinping that his current trajectory is the right trajectory, right? The more the conversation on Taiwan heats up, the more it affirms for Xi Jinping that he has to be able to fortify China's economy from potential sanctions by the United States. The more he develops the PLA, the more it affirms for the United States the necessity of technology controls to make sure that the PLA does not get access to cutting edge technologies which could end up killing Americans on the battlefield. And the more the United States does that, the more Xi Jinping is going to think he needs to plow even more money into industrial policy, recognizing there's going to be a lot of inefficiency, but of the view that you don't make an omelet without breaking eggs. And this is, I think, fundamentally dangerous for China's economy and China's trajectory. So I don't see a way out of this spiral. And I think unless you have a much more benign view of what the geopolitical environment over the next 10 years looks like, I think the reality is that the United States and China are caught in a mutually reinforcing spiral. And one where I think China's going to get the worst end of it because there is no processes for course corrections. It's not a partisan comment, but we have an election coming up in November. We may get a course correction. It may not be the course correction that I would like, but nonetheless, you have at least that element of vitality, and I don't see that in China today. So let me end there. And happy to take questions, comments, criticisms, concerns. Yes, sir.
Thank you for that. Do you see any evidence of Xi Jinping trying to tackle the huge amount of local government debt that is right now besetting China at the moment?
Yes, for sure.
And, oh, sorry, I might follow up quickly and say, do you think it'll work?
Around 2015, 2016, I think Xi Jinping was convinced that local government debt was a political risk. And you've seen the deleveraging campaign not reverse the debt trend, but at least you're seeing it moderate. And that's one of the reasons that there is the continuing austerity regime in China is, I think Xi Jinping's view is, we're not going to return to 2008, 2009 playbook. We need to see local governments take some pain because they've grown to view that Beijing is a backstop. And the result of that, though, is local government finances are in an absolute mess because it's the twin convergence of austerity enforced by Beijing, trying to crack down on off-balance sheet borrowing, with the ongoing real estate correction, which means local governments have had their primary funding model blown up. And it's gone from bad to worse with, you probably all hear the anecdotes as well, local governments having to go out to entrepreneurs and ask for loans so that they can cover payroll, having to claw back bonuses from local officials because they can't pay them. This is one where if I was thinking about Xi Jinping dared to ask me what the economic strategy would be, I'd say worry less about geopolitical competition and worry more about the growing crisis of local government finances. Because if you're really worried about social stability in China, I'd be far less worried about external hostile forces. I'd be much more worried about are local officials getting paid and how are local governments raising revenue. Cameron.
Jude, I had a question on China's relationship with Europe. So when you talk about a counter-containment strategy, it almost sounds a bit like a catch-22 in that the approach China is taking to prosecute its counter-containment strategy is tempting countries to try and contain it. So what we've seen from Europe in the last year or so is a huge number of investigations into what they consider to be Chinese unfair trading practices. And Xi Jinping has, of course, travelled to Europe recently and he's chosen Serbia, Hungary, France as his places to visit. It's almost as if it's speeding up Europe's decision to consider China to be a threat. Can you talk us through Xi's logic here. Traditionally, they obviously tried to divide and conquer the US and its allies. It seems to be they're, as you said, going down a counter-containment strategy, which is almost sort of pushing allies and partners into one bucket.
I think that's much more apparent in China's own backyard than it is in Europe. You mentioned the trip to Europe. I think if you're just looking at, the trip to France, Xi Jinping, Macron invited von der Leyen to join a meeting, and I'm sure Xi Jinping heard from Macron deep frustration about ongoing support for Russia, and from von der Leyen heard about concerns over overcapacity. Just prior to that, Chancellor of Germany goes to Beijing and probably sends a signal to Beijing that there are wedges that are still there. So whereas I think the Chinese assessment is the United States has basically built an effective coalition in the Indo-Pacific, even though there's a little bit of wedge space, but basically the Philippines, India, Australia, Japan, South Korea, I think they feel Europe is much more in play. Because I was just in Brussels, a week and a half ago, the Europeans feel that Europe is much more in play. And countries like, increasingly France, but certainly the European Commission are frustrated about where Germany is. Last year, it was reversed. Macron had a trip to Beijing where he gave a set of baffling remarks on the back end of it, basically saying to Xi Jinping, we don't agree with the Americans on Taiwan, whereas Scholz went to Beijing and extracted out of Xi Jinping public comments warning off the Russians from threatening nuclear weapons. Now it's the reverse of that. So I think the Chinese feel like Europe is much more in play. And again, I think it would be less, the Chinese view is on any given issue, even if there's broadly a bloc, on any given issue in Europe, you have influence over the extent to which, how far Europe will go on an issue, right? So Taiwan, very much a live issue where I think the Chinese feel that they can, by hook or by crook, divide Europe, get some European countries, getting silence from a European country is about just as good as getting them to say anything public. But I also agree with your comment that I think Beijing oftentimes fails to understand second and third order effects, and is, if it played a bit more honey and less vinegar, I think from the US perspective, the US would have a much harder time in some of this coalition building. That's certainly the case in this neck of the woods where, were it not for China's own actions, the discussion in Japan would not be nearly as advanced as it is, right? That's very much a reflection of China's own actions more so than it is, diplomatic mastery by the United States. But I don't think Beijing registers that. Please.
Hi, thank you, Jude. I'm interested in the change of Xi market ideas across 2015 and 2016. It seems like you highlight the 2015 stock market turbulence as an exogenous shock to the Xi's idea, and shifting causing as an alarming lesson, then highlight the political risks associated with the market development. I'm very curious why this crisis can change the Xi's idea so dramatically. And we know China has survived several economic crises. This is not the only crisis China experienced. Asian financial crisis, global financial crisis, but China's market ideas hasn't changed so transformatively like in the Xi's era. So I'm very curious about why this crisis can put along such a transformative change in the Chinese economy.
Yeah, certainly China has dealt with economic shocks before. That was the first economic crisis that Xi Jinping had to deal with personally. And I was living in Beijing at the time. The level of concern, because that was also tied up with, you had so many Chinese who had basically been told equity markets only go up, that when you started to see this crash, it was like it was a twin concern of an actual economic contagion, but it was also a political event because there was massive amounts of frustration on behalf of a lot of Chinese who said, we were told that essentially this is a sure thing. So I think it was a political and an economic crisis tied into one that is the reason it had such an effect. And again, there was a month period where Chinese leadership, especially economic policymakers, were extraordinarily worried about how far and fast this would go, throughout onshore equity markets, but also just at a political level. You were seeing protests, all over, not massive protests, but you were seeing sort of unrest and protests at investment houses all over the country. So I think that's why it had an effect. I don't think this was the most traumatic thing that has happened in Xi Jinping's life, but I do think in terms of a trajectory of becoming increasingly skeptical about market mechanisms, it was an important moment. Please.
Thank you so much for the talk. You mentioned about the US-China competition in the area of technology and trade, and I wonder, could you elaborate more about the West response to China's outflow of FDI, particularly the Belt and Road Initiative? In 2021, during the G7 summit, the Biden administration announced the Build Back Better Road Initiative, but since that,
you haven't heard about it, have you?
So I wonder, how come the B3W couldn't be materialized?
It won't. First of all, I just can't get over the bad grammar of that. Build back better. Always very, very frustrating. It is a number of initiatives. Do you remember the Blue Dot Initiative? No. There have been a number of initiatives that the United States rolled out to try to counter the BRI. And most of them ineffectual. I think for a couple reasons. Number one, we don't do economic statecraft well. We don't have the institutions to do it well. We don't have the financing to do it well. And the result is the Blue Dot Network and Build Back Better world. I also think there was a little bit more rationality about the BRI as we saw the BRI shrink a little bit in footprint. The high point of BRI funding was 2016. That's where you're seeing silly investments like buying bowling alleys in Poughkeepsie, New York. Interestingly, right before I moved from Beijing in March 2018, I had a meeting with some Chinese bankers who told me that they were just starting to do advisory for some of the state lenders about risk. Because up until 2017, 2018, none of the state, Ex-Im Bank, no one doing any of the loans thought about risk when they were doing BRI loans. But then they started to see what happens when you empower, SOEs and other actors to make loans without any thought of ROI. So I think the U.S. conversation has shifted a little bit as BRI sort of retrenched. I think there's a little bit more rationality about how concerned we should be about it. Thankfully, there's no new initiatives being rolled out by the Biden administration. Instead, I think they shifted to thinking about ways that they could try to counter China on trade and investment. So that's where you saw things like, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. That really became the focus, in part because they were hearing demand signals from partners and allies in the region who wanted less a small-scale bad version of the BRI, and instead said they wanted the United States as an active trade partner. And things like IPEF were then where the United States started to focus instead of sort of BRI. Please.
It's the 1st of October 1949, the very first thing the Americans said, traitors in the US State Department. In 1951, Jude, President Harry Truman didn't hesitate to say, I'm considering dropping a nuclear weapon on China. In 1953, and friends of mine in Fujian province were getting boats ready to go and to push Chiang Kai-shek out of Taiwan. They're confronted by an American fleet. Yeah. The question is, don't you think sometimes that the United States is wrong? And look at your black record in Vietnam, where the Americans openly said we'll drop, argued between Truman, not Truman, but what's his name, President Kissinger and the President, What about dropping an atom bomb on China? All of these things coalesce together and they make the Chinese people and the Chinese government deeply suspicious. And you're not going to stop them by trying to stop chips or economic warfare.
So I think the question is the US wrong?
Yeah, I mean, sure. To me, it's such a banal, obvious point. If we were in a different talk and the talk was failures and hypocrisies of US foreign policy, we could spend days. So, 100%.
Okay.
So,
Other questions?
I think, by the way, though, I think we can have a talk about both, and both are important. I think it's also important to be able to talk about where China has erred has erred on its own. And again, I live in the United States. We're drowning in books criticizing the United States over nearly all aspects of its foreign policy. So I agree. I just think it's self-evident to me that the United States screws up foreign policy all the time. Please.
I just have a quick question talking about competition. So I'm just thinking China actually kind of very much, kind of like, let's say, considering China's interdependence, with the global economy. So my question is, how realistic for China to, let's say, achieve what you just told me, the counter-containment strategy?
How realistic is it for China to achieve?
Yeah, considering China's interdependence.
Right. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-on question?
Yeah.
To that, Jude, if you don't mind? Because you highlighted Xi Jinping's, or you spoke about his distraction with great power competition, the securitization agenda, and you suggested that he's distracted from a lot of domestic policy concerns that should be given greater consideration. And that indeed is what might be the reckoning that comes down the line. Surely there are people at senior levels in the administration, we know there are lots of people that are well-trained, have a good understanding of these structural economic issues. Is it that we're dealing with a situation of the emperor's new clothes, overreach,
Yeah.
that these voices aren't offering some kind of counterbalance to what you paint as a real focus on the security agenda and great power competition?
Yeah, great question. I think the strategy is, can China build out enough protection and resilience that leverage the United States has can be mitigated as far as possible. So it's not perfect success where you are autarkic and the United States has no leverage over you. I think it's where you've built up enough protections that the United States no longer has a veto vote over your economic development model. I think that's probably their vision of success. But look, if you look at the C919, which is China's new indigenous plane, it's almost all foreign components. It's really hard in a globalized economy of scale and have to be self-sufficient. And China's navigating that reality right now. I think that's why when the Chinese meet with the US, the top issue they bring up is technology controls. Because there are some areas like legacy chips. China can probably build out self-sufficiency in legacy semiconductors in the next 10 years. Not cutting edge, but legacy, which is good enough to run pretty much everything at a good enough level. But there are going to be other things where China is for a long time going to be dependent on not just the United States, but the Netherlands, right? And the UK and Taiwan, that I think are going to be very challenging for them to navigate. On the voices inside the party, certainly most of the folks that I engage with think this is the wrong economic trajectory for China. I would say, though, that the more the US pushes and squeezes China, even the more pro-reform market economists see some value in Xi Jinping's policy agenda. But nonetheless, I think you're already seeing voices on industrial policy warning that we're going to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. That was very noticeable after the technology crackdown in the summer of what was that, 2021? Deep concern that if we're going to quash the Jack Ma's of the world, if there's going to be no new Jack Ma, you're going to kill a whole generation of innovators who wanted to be a next Jack Ma, who wanted to create the next technology startup. So those voices are out there. I think what's different now is I don't see many of them who have a seat at the table. If you think, Zhou Xiaochuans are gone, even the Liu He's, who was semi-market friendly, is now in just an external advisory role. That whole generation of market, pro-market economists are not even at the table anymore.
There were a couple more hands. Can we perhaps hear the rest of the questions together, Jude?
Sure. Oh, sure.
And then hopefully they intersect.
Sure.
So, as is shown, there are many foreign companies withdraw in China, and do you think it will cause a blow to the Chinese economy? And do you think is it the cause or the result of Xi Jinping's policy? That's my question.
These are companies leaving China? Yeah. Okay. So okay, that's one.
Graham?
Keep it really short. The origin and logic of 涉外法治, foreign-related rule of law, seems very close to your talk. The origin and logic of 涉外法治, the foreign-related rule of law, which I think is one of the more interesting new directions from the top level.
Is overcapacity being deliberately pursued for the dual circulation strategy, or is it just the result of the macroeconomic imbalance?
Was the last part of it, or
is it just like the result of economic imbalance?
There was one more I saw over here. Yes, please.
I actually have a three-part question.
Can you just get to the needed?
Yeah, of course.
The most important.
So I want you to kind of like glaze into a crystal ball and kind of look into the future and say, like, in 2027, do you think Xi Jinping will have a successor appointed? And then I guess I wouldn't believe that, like, if I was saying that, but like, then looking forward, so in 2032, would you think the economy, Chinese economy, will be more closed than today? And then I guess the last part of that will be,
can we leave it at that? We're already out of time. I have that to you.
Three-part question is a euphemism for three different questions.
Yeah.
Companies leaving China. I think there's decoupling-ish. If you look at no big companies that are in China have unilaterally or fully pulled out of China. I think what's happening is marginal dollars are now not going to China. Or if it was going to be if 10 years ago it would have been $1 going into the China market, now it's 50 cents. And 50 cents is going elsewhere. The European Chamber of Commerce in China just put out their annual survey. And for the first time ever, for the companies surveyed, and these are companies in China, China is not one of their top 3 markets. I think this is not really about, it's about Xi Jinping, but I think this is just more broadly, it's a combination of factors. China's structural slowdown is now in its second decade. China's growth peaked in 2011. So the growth slowdown is not a news story, but it's much more pronounced now. I think regulatory uncertainty. For investors, I think the feeling is a lot of the market openings that they had hoped for aren't there. Fourth, it's becoming a much tougher market for US companies and Western companies dealing with Chinese competitors. A lot of them are very, very good. Fifth, I think, is some geopolitical concerns. tensions in the Taiwan Strait. That's not determinative, but I think all of those together mean that when you have your board meeting and you're thinking about China strategy and how much money you want to put there, folks are now starting to say, let's try to find some markets outside of China. So that's why I think it's kind of decoupling-ish. It's not pure decoupling, but certainly marginal dollars are now going elsewhere. Graham, I'm going to skip your question because I have no knowledge about how to answer it. Overcapacity. What was it? Is it overcapacity? Is a what or a what? Is it a
as a deliberate strategy for like the dual circulation strategy, or is it just a result?
Yeah. If overcapacity was a brand new issue that we had not experienced before, I would think it's a new function of a dual circulation strategy. Overcapacity is a feature, not a bug of China's industrial system, right? This is a structural part of the political economy of China. So NEVs throw a dart at a local government. They will have an innovation cluster, and they will have 6 NEV startups, and it's being fueled by industrial funds, industrial policy funds, and so everyone is ramping up on NEVs and batteries, and that's sort of structurally how you get overcapacity. I think it's hard to say whether it's an intentional strategy or not. I think they're comfortable that this is the way they scale up quickly and end up getting a few winners. Is you have lots of competition, fierce competition at the early stage of the market. We see this in sector after sector after sector after sector. At some point, you begin to see some market consolidation. Those are the winners, and then you back the winners and you push them out into global markets. And by the way, you get to do that in a relatively isolated, protected market structure, right? Where Chinese companies can essentially grow without a whole lot of foreign competition in industries where they don't want that competition. You get good, and then you scale out. I thought, when I didn't quite hear what you're saying, a lot of our Chinese interlocutors are wondering if U.S. and European concerns over overcapacity are just an election issue. I think that's how a lot of the Chinese think of this is, or at least the ones we talk to, is this is clearly just a Biden election strategy, which I think to some extent misses the point. 2027, no successor. Put it another way, Xi Jinping will stay in office till he dies. And by the way, I don't think that's unique to him. That's the reason we have term limits. FDR would still be president, right? The whole point of Lord of the Rings is once you have the ring of power, you never want to take it off. So I think this is just an old story about power and convincing yourself you need to stay in office. So I think he'll stay until he can't be there. 2032, yeah, I mean, building off of that, the course correction we've seen for China traditionally has been the death of a leader, or the few times we've seen the peaceful transition of power, right? So starting with Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao. And so every 10 years or so, you would get a new leadership coterie in, and you'd get the prospect of some course correction. And that mechanism is gone now. And I think safe prediction number one, the geopolitical environment is going to become even more contested and rivalrous. Assumption number two, the more rivalrous it gets, the more it just affirms for Xi Jinping, we basically got to fortify. And so I think the Chinese economy will look even more fortified and closed 10 years from now, than it does now. What I don't have a good glimpse on is, at what point does that start intersecting with stability issues? We've predicted 30 of the last 0 collapses of the Communist Party, so we're not good at that. And I think we're so quick. There'll be an economist cover every time the economy slows that sort of shows Xi Jinping barely holding on to power. So I'm weary of over projecting that, but you do start to think that if you have local government finances in a mess, if you have the economy really grinding along, and to the Warren Buffett adage, you don't know who's swimming naked until the tide goes out. we're in a new paradigm of China, and much lower growth is going to probably reveal pathologies that we didn't see when the economy was growing at 8, 9, 10%. So I think there's going to be a lot of other issues around stability which will emerge as the growth slowdown grinds on and as the system kind of continues to securitize.
Thanks so much, Jude. Please join me in thanking Jude.
Thank you.
Thank you.